It is so good to see you, Dr. Thangaraj. So let's start with your background. Of course, you have such an interesting, rich history. Coming here, growing up where you did. So please enlighten us. Tell us all about that.
Yeah, so I am the first person in nearly 150 years along the male line in my family who is not an ordained Christian minister. So my father came to the US in 1980 to pursue a PhD in theology. And so that was the first moment we came to the US as kids. And I came at age 6 to Boston. My father was doing his PhD at Harvard. And in Cambridge, 1980 Celtics. Imagine the era had just started with Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and the addition of my hero, Robert Parrish. Like that was the team. I was covered in green. I love that stuff. And when my dad finished his PhD, his goal was always to go back and work in the colleges in India. So we went back. But the 3 years in Cambridge set me so far back academically that even though I was going only into the fourth grade in India, I was so far back. So for 5 years, I spent trying to catch up and be average, especially with the math and the sciences. And my parents realized that that type of social mobility for their kids would not happen here in India because, I was so far back. And so my dad applied for a job, got a job at Emory, and we came to Atlanta in 1988. And that was at the height of Dominique Wilkins, the human highlight film, and the Michael Jordan era. So as a kid, as someone who always loved sports and sports made sense with me and thinking about who I was in this world and the ways in which I formed a sense of community, basketball and great basketball teams in major cities were always there. But as a professor's kid and getting to know mostly the kids of faculty or kids at my school, which was very black and white, I did not know about the South Asian American community. So I always played it up as this person who was in between whiteness and blackness. And the names I was given was that, like some of my closest African American friends at Emory, their nickname for me was Arabic Jordan. Instead of Air Jordan, Arabic Jordan, right? And and that's where the understanding of the brown person as Muslim, as Arab, from the Middle East, from India, all those things that play out in how our global war on terror and the ways in which Islamophobia works in the U.S. That was already playing out in the 90s, right? And so for me, basketball was that place where I could stake a claim to Americanness, even if I wasn't fitting with the racial binaries of black and white. But it was in college that I came to understand of something called Indo-Pak basketball. And for the first time in my life, playing against the South Asian American community who were incredible and were so much better than me, where I went from a really good player to an average player in that space when I thought I would be moving from black and white spaces where I was very good to dominating in a space that I thought, oh, that's where the nerds hang out, instead of being reflective and seeing myself in the mirror, right?
Wow. Okay, there's a lot in there. I love that. So let's first. I mean, you started with sports, and the sports theme has carried throughout. So obviously that had a huge impact. And you said it makes sense. It gave you a sense of community. How did that play from when you had like kind of two stints in the U.S.? You started
Yes.
there, went to India. How did it continue when you had that time in India, and then when you came back?
That is a brilliant question. And that's one thing that we forget how things travel, right? Like our cultural ideologies, cultural practices, popular culture travels, but it's not consumed in the same way. So when I went back, I was starting fourth grade in India. There was a basketball court at the college that my dad taught at. And nobody played basketball there except for one time during the year when there were intramurals, and only faculty played. And as a faculty child, people were not letting me play. So when I went back to India, my love of sports actually had a very different type of class and caste aesthetic to it. So most of the kids I started to play with were the children of the staff on campus. Folks doing everything from administrative labor to really tough, menial, hands-on labor like cleaning gutters, cutting down trees, sweeping, right? So their kids became some of my closest and best friends. And because of that, the ways in which sport in India at that point in the late 80s and 90s had a certain caste consciousness other than if you played cricket. I grew up playing kabaddi, which is, South Asian game, a mix between, wrestling and tackle football, in a way. So grew up playing kabaddi a bit, but really took to playing cricket, field hockey, and soccer. So we played that a lot. And when I got a little bit older, it became volleyball. And everywhere I went, especially in Christian communities, there was so much love for sport. And so I might not see it in places in at my school, maybe, when I was hanging out with my Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh friends. But in the Christian community, especially on our colleges, there was a strong focus on sport. The ways in which ideas of muscular Christianity that played out in the West was also playing out in India as well. And that also tied with a long history of Indians with wrestling. And so there were all these things that made kabaddi, field hockey, cricket, and soccer and volleyball the sports I played all the time as a kid. And then I come to Atlanta, and I'm in a school where the first day people ask me, "What the hell are you?" And I could only imagine, I don't know what that means on so many realms. So they broke it down and said, "Are you black and white, black or white?" And the only thing that could come to mind for me was they're using ideas of colors that I've never heard. So I said, "I guess I'm gray." They said, "No, that doesn't work." And so that community, and this is where I think in this moment of anti-black racism and police brutality, the community that imagined a world that was expansive was the black community. And they were the ones at my school who welcomed me from the very get-go. Whereas my first instances of being teased and bullied were with the white and the white Jewish kids at my school, right? And so Atlanta, at that historical moment in the late 80s, had put something called the M to M program, where they took high achieving black students from majority black schools and bused them to really high achieving white public schools. So I was at that school near Emory, that was a white public school, and these African Americans were coming from all over Atlanta, from far, far away, and they were the ones that opened up a sense of community that was already welcoming to me, and that's how I really got into basketball as well. And there was a cricket league, one of the greatest cricketers, West Indian cricketers ever, was in Atlanta. And I went to school with his son, but I didn't know that till I went back in 2006 to do research. And then I was like, wait, Chris and Phil Lewis's dad is Desmond Lewis, the Guinness Book West Indian cricketer? So I had no access to cricket. And so I chose baseball and basketball instead as my sports.
I'm trying to see if there's any correlation, because earlier you said sports, but particularly basketball, had this Americanness about it. And then you talked about the association with Christianity, and then kind of maybe wider, like field hockey, cricket, and even kabaddi, which I've played in Asari. Try playing kabaddi in Asari. It's the best.
Awesome.
And then I also played cricket in Asari because I just wanted to experience what that's like. Like Indian femininity meets Indian masculinity is pretty cool. But how did all those play out now? You know, sports as, and you've mentioned it's time and time again, it gave you a sense of community no matter where you were going, and a sense of belonging, but belonging to who, where, in relation to others, you know?
Yeah. So it was sport that in many ways, basketball, that gave me the language of belonging for a kid who had just come from India with an accent, you know, without a sense of community. Most of the children at my school, most of my peers had gone through the same system, the white peers. So they had known each other since elementary school. And here I am coming in the ninth grade, which is basically the equivalent to hell, right? I mean, you don't want to be a new kid in a high school. And so for me, it was incredible to see the ways in which the openness of the Black community. And at that point in the 80s, there were only about 5,000 South Asian immigrants in Atlanta. And so they were so far spread out that there was never a majority for people to know them in that way, and for them to be really have, folks on the local level did not have an idea of what it meant to be Indian or to be Indian American or Pakistani American. And so for me, the Black community was the one that, because of the ways in which they had already experienced marginalization at that school, they had much greater and open parameters of what belonging was. That was the community that, the very first one of, giving me a space to eat lunch, inviting me to their homes, right? That happened specifically with the African American community.
That's beautiful. And I know that these influences have carried on into your work to this day. Your teaching, your book, and various other works that you've shared with us in the world. So I would love to know specifically, what is the work you're doing now? How did you get there? How have these moments that you shared with us shaped all of that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where one of the things you see with anthropology is a shift to, instead of going outside of the local to examine culture, and going outside of our borders to understand difference. I try my best to really critically engage with Black feminist theory, women of color feminist theory, and queer of color critique, to look at the ways in which, in our own communities, how can we understand the heterogeneity of cultural identities and politics within the US. So for me, my vision of anthropology has, and my methods have always been very local. How can you engage the local to then tease out the longer transnational and trans-historical links? And thus, my first project on, the South Asian Indo-Pak Basketball League was a way to think about how does the practice of South Asian masculinity, South Asian American sporting masculinity, always be a transnational project, right? Like, one of the really well-known teams was a team from Chicago called Chicago Untouchables. And that, these are mostly Malayali players who are Christian, who are already challenging the idea of Christians as folks who come from the lowest caste, who could have been at one point deemed the untouchables. But it's also women who came first, who are already seen as differently constituted subjects within the Indian imaginary and the Hindu imaginary as much more untouchable than men, right? Because of, having periods, that idea of pollution and so on. And within the Malayali community, women came first to the US. Other than in other communities where the men came first, most often the women came as nurses. And as nurses, so here you have these men playing up with that idea of how untouchability is understood in India and reconfiguring it and giving it new meanings, while also tying up with Chicago and the history of Prohibition era politics, where you have the movie Untouchables, right? And then to play upon that language of untouchable, as in, man, I can't be touched on the basketball court. You can't hold me. You can't you can't D me up. I'm going to score on you, right? I'm untouchable. All those meanings all converge to show the transnational links. And by studying the local, we can really explore the global, right? And to see the blurring of those spaces as always global instead of global or local. And so my newest project actually started when I was doing my postdoc at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And I wanted to actually study the Somali community, where a lot of them are employed as taxi drivers. And to me, I thought, wow, what does it mean to be a taxi driver in the South, and to be an immigrant or refugee taxi driver in the South, where there is no union? So fighting for rights is incredibly precarious. And during those conversations, I met up with some Kurdish community members, and I found out that in 2010 there was a streak of break-ins and folks having stuff stolen from their homes, their cars being completely jacked. And so I thought to myself, oh, who are these Kurdish communities? And so I reached out to the mayor, and the mayor brought in the chief of police and the commander of that precinct, the South Precinct, where most of the Kurds lived in Nashville. And through those conversations, we were able to create these links and look at the ways in which both scholars and organizers on the ground can work together to create better spaces and more equitable, equitable spaces of justice, and to really create better partnerships with police. And in that process, during one of the conversations, one of the young women I got to know, we started talking. And as you know very well, I love food. I'm a pig. I eat anything and everything and all the time. And so we started talking about foods, and I told her my favorite food in the world is biryani. And she said, biryani? You know, Kurds make the best biryani. And I was like, oh, no, she didn't. She didn't just take something that is particularly South Asian and claim it. And so I was so curious about what this kind of connection and this way in which she brought together longer histories of cultural cross-pollination between West Asia and South Asia that I had never imagined. And in various other interviews too, my experiences, Kurds often said, Indians and Kurds, we're the same. And I would always say, what in the world does that mean? So they would say, well, one, we all belong in the Indo-European language family. Kurdish and Hindi and Punjabi, all of those languages are in the Indo-European language family. And then they would follow up by saying, and if you look at the histories of Aryans and Aryanism, you'll see it stretches from what we imagine as Kurdistan all the way through Iran, Afghanistan, to India. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. So there are ways in which Kurds are employing this sense at the local level during this time of the global war on terror, ideas of Kurdish identity that bring in various types of other communities, Persians and Indians, as part of Aryan kin and part of the Indo-European language family. At the same moment, it says, even though we are colonized by Arabs in Syria and Iraq, by Turks in Turkey and Persians in Iran, we are not Arabs. And that some even claimed Islam was imposed on us. So that was that moment where I started to realize, what are these ways of mediating identity, both in a transnational and a transhistorical moment of bringing in that history of Persian movement to India, right? That I immediately realized this was part of the project of imagining self that involved both, bringing in ideas of Iran, India, and Afghanistan at the same moment. It meant engaging with the global war on terror to see how do we not become misstereotyped and racialized as Arabs and as Muslims during this time of the global war on terror. So I wanted to look at basically the South, like also bring in these figures in the South who are very strange figures when we think of the South as black and white. That was a lot. I don't know if that made sense, but
it made a ton of sense. I mean, now playing with back to the community that welcomed you when you came back to the U.S. And then you had this nickname, Arabic Jordan. How did all of that, like, you went on to further study this kind of in the time of like the height. Maybe it was one of the heights of Islamophobia. It's still there, and yet trying to distinguish your own identity as like you are not of that religion, but you're not anti. So it's like how was it applied to you? How is it applied to some of the police relations you mentioned? Like what can we take away from all that you learned from these transnational identities?
yeah, one of the things you see is that the ways in which people can conceptualize, identity back home does not translate over smoothly, right? The ways in which specifically Kurds, some of the Kurds who really stress themselves as Indo-European and thus linked closer to Europeans and claiming Aryanness, that Aryanness does not translate into the whiteness, right? That is given to, a long history of Europeans that were eventually able to claim whiteness, like the Irish and the Polish and the Italians. But here, what happens is when they come to the US, there's a way in which their claims to Aryanness or whiteness back home are not mediated in the same way in the US, where a different racial logic way works. And in the US, the logic of white and non-white does not really allow for the ways in which Aryanness is conceptualized back home to translate into a whiteness here in the US. So they are lumped in together with the very same communities who they postured against back home to say we are distinctly Kurds. We're not Arab, we're not Persian, we're not Turks. But in the US, the concept of non-white, and especially the concept of the Arab as an ever-catching racial category and a racial formation, really takes away the ways in which these identities and these practices of race have worked back in the homeland. But they're still critical within their own communities to assure them of a certain type of history or mythical history that might be useful in that sense. And so you see the ways in which these communities that might have identified differently back home are now working with Arabs and working with a wide set of Middle Eastern communities and a wide set of Muslim communities, especially in Nashville. The role of Kurdish activists in fighting for civil rights in the most expansive way that is inclusive of Black Lives Matter, that is inclusive of critiques of the wall, critiques of children in cages, critiques of immigration, and very clear critiques of white supremacy that might not have shaped up in any other context. So there's something about September 11th that has also opened up possibilities for new types of coalition building that might not have been possible within these communities. And so that's where you see Pakistani Muslims forming, when I was doing my research, they were working in their local mosques with a wide set of ethnic and racial others to create a space where Muslimness and Americanness were on the same plane, right? And so these are important points that we have to understand, that these moments of, state violence are also met with moments of resistance and moments of reconfiguring identities in much more expansive ways that allow us to really challenge in the most fundamental way how white supremacy operates and its mode of racial classification.
Yeah. Did you see some of that alignment with Black Lives Matter in the Kurdish community, but also other non-white, non-Black communities start, when you were doing your research, and how, what was your reaction, your personal reaction, your reaction as an academic, and how do you think it's played into today? I mean, how do you feel?
Yes, so for me, one of the things I'm most surprised by is the ways in which there has been a rise in incredibly leftist progressive politics within the South Asian American community, especially among youth, and especially among youth who are challenging their caste status, challenging their class status, seeing the heterogeneity of South Asian America and its experience of racial, violence, especially in the lead up to the 2016 Trump campaign, right? The way in which 3 different Hindus were killed, Hindu Indians. So you have this challenge where there's an incredible emergence of young people and their activism. At the same moment, you also see the consolidation of incredibly conservative Hindu fundamentalist organizations in the US. Thus, the power of Hindus for Trump and their alliance with Modi, right? And so you have these the simultaneous social formations and movements taking place that we're hoping that one is going to continuously open this door to bring in a wide set of political actors and a wide set of ideologies and goals that might really create a vision of citizenship that is inclusive of all. While the other goes back to old myths of Hindu supremacy, old myths of Aryanism and Indo-Europeanism, and really stressing class and caste as a way to make oneself seem respectable in the diaspora that closes its doors to a wide swath of communities. And with the Kurdish community, I saw something very different because most of the young men I met for my book Desi Hoop Dreams were men whose parents, for the most part, came as professionals, and they themselves went to prestigious four-year colleges, got great jobs in the medical field or the finance field. Whereas the Kurds I got to know, a lot of them, their parents were not trained in formal educational institutions. They were often farmers. And coming as refugees with little to nothing, they had they were housed in Section 8 housing. So that means from their very instant, their very first moment in the US, it was learning the system of Americanness through communities of color. And thus, thus the Kurdish experience was already much more open to imagining community and imagining politics that was inclusive of a wide swath of Black diasporas. So that meant the African American community, a huge, nearly 15,000 Somalis in Nashville, nearly several thousand South Sudanese, several thousand Coptic Copts from Egypt. And so you have this incredible engagement with racism that is also forming communities with other communities of color. So you see the ways that these communities have already organized and forced and really called on the mayor at that point, Carl Dean, to have a New Americans Advisory Council, which was already that first step to claiming a sense of racial justice and racial politics and racial representation that was from the very onset multiple. So on that mayor's advisory council, which I got invited to be a part of through the work of the refugee and immigrant community, there was a South Sudanese person, a Kurdish person, a Somali person, I'm a Latina, a Chinese American, right? It was such a diverse setting that made politics and advocacy already multiracial. And so, thus, the Kurdish community, even now, they have been really key figures in fighting for Black Lives Matter. But we have to take that in consideration with what the Somali activist and South Sudanese tell me, which is yes, we are part of a community, we fight together, but mainstream America, read as white, still sees Kurds as the good allies because of US military alliance back in the Middle East. They recognize Kurds as a certain type of ethnic and racial other, and they have greater possibility of mobility rather than Somalis and South Sudanese, whose blackness carries very different types of burdens and limitations and brings forth new forms of state violence, right? So even those moments where there's great possibilities, there are also limits to the work that one can do because how they organize as multiracial is not how the local Nashville community sees them. They still see them as this mysterious Kurdish other and then Black communities instead of seeing the heterogeneity of Blackness.
And speaking of that heterogeneity, within Black communities and immigrant Black communities, how have they? I mean, of course, it sounds like you've seen a lot of participation back then, and especially now with the Black Lives Matter movement. But are there any kind of internal differences or just discord or anything that you'd like to share that you've observed?
Yeah, yeah, and I think and I think it might be best for me to share in the most general sense, right? Which is when we look at diasporic communities, especially in the US, we have to engage the histories that they travel with and how those histories become a compass to how they make sense of community, right? And in particular, and your question is so important here because it asks us to rethink what are the politics within the community. And so, one of the things I've seen in my research on the South Asian American community in a very broad sense, but specifically Muslim Pakistani Americans, and then my work on the Kurdish community, mostly Kurds from Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as some Kurds from Turkish Kurdistan and some from Syrian Kurdistan and a few from Iranian Kurdistan, is we have to look at in the diaspora the contours of ethno nationalism in diasporic spaces. Who become the voices of the community? And as voices of the community, what are the points of silence? What voices are not allowed to be in the same way? And what voices always pop up as a way to represent the community that is also based on particular heterosexual, affluent, professional, members of that community. The ways in which that then becomes a representation of the entire community that refuses to acknowledge the politics within, right? And that's where on my work on Kurdish diasporas, it's been really, really interesting to see the ways in which the Kurdish diasporas from Turkey and their relation to Kurdish politics in Turkey and Kurdish organizations in Turkey and their worship of Öcalan, who is one of the Turkish leaders, one of the founders of the PKK, who's been in jail, has become a theorist, a scholar in many ways, and has called for, really challenging these ideas of, religion and the importance of the nation state. And what that's done is for some Kurds in the diaspora, when they consume Öcalan's, description of radical politics, that they've started to stigmatize the Kurds from Iraq, who come from different Kurdish political parties that don't see Öcalan as their mythical hero, right, or their key leader. And it's also because of this, they're also deemed by some Turkish Kurds as backward, as uncivilized, as too Muslim, and thus have been too Arabized and have lost their Kurdish, identity. Well, Iraqi Kurds that I've gotten to know in Nashville claim their Islam to say, let us give you a version of Kurdish Islam, where Islam and Kurdishness and modernity are all on the same plane, right? And so there are all these internal conflicts that we have to be very, very careful not to essentialize Kurdishness as a monolith, as a singular thing, but rather look at the ways in which Kurdishness comes to be. Like, what are the conditions through which Kurdishness comes to be that can then give us a greater sense of how difference operates within the community?
I love
And
that.
in yeah. And in particular, for folks who are really interested in seeing that, to go and check out the work of Naveen Barwari, who Naveen's work really brings together her experiences as a Kurdish artist of being born in Nashville, but going to school in Iraqi Kurdistan and then coming back to Nashville for college. And so her art covers a broad spectrum of transnational negotiations of Kurdishness, where this constant movement has also made her really decouple any idea of Kurdistan and Kurdish identity as being located in one place, where all of a sudden Kurdishness makes sense as something on the move. And that's where you also see the work of Bezar Aradini, who is another Kurdish artist who is inserting the stories of women, right? Again, how does ethno-nationalism pop up that it becomes men as emblems, as the speakers, as the agents of the community? And And Bezar, in her incredible work, weaves together through fabric, creates these incredible textured, embroidered art that gives life to the stories of women who have either been left behind or whose stories have not really come to the surface, to really deal with how the tensions within the community are also based on gender, class, migration status. Yeah.
Nice. Um, I wanted to, I mean, everyone can sense the passion you have for all of these communities and the connections you've drawn and noticed, and how it's increased your understanding of, um, what you experience belonging to different communities, and how people have taken that as they move from certain communities, certain countries. I'd just love to know, in your own words, why do you do what you do? Why do you teach? Why do you research these communities, and how what keeps you moving through these spaces?
Wow. I think that might be the most unfair question I have ever heard, the most difficult question I've ever heard. Um, so for me, the reason I've really engaged with these communities is because they give me a sense of the expansive possibilities of citizenship and belonging that can be constructed, that are not given by the nation, right? So they give me a sense of the ways in which legal citizenship does not promise the rights and livelihoods promised within the paper, right? That legality itself is a farce, that it does not lead to a sense of ownership of one's body, ownership of one's rights, or a claim to public spaces. And that's what my first book, Desi Hoop Dreams, the major contradiction is for these young South Asian American men to perform American sporting masculinity and to perform Americanness in general. It could not be done within the basketball court in public spaces because they were stereotyped. They heard racial taunts such as "Go back to Afghanistan," "Go drink a Slurpee," "terrorist," "nerd." So the very claim to Americanness is fleeting in public spaces. So they had to create their own private basketball spaces that are ethnic only to be able to claim Americanness. That American public spaces were never free of racial politics and exclusions. And it was through the creation, by having capital and having the money to be able to buy out spaces, basketball spaces, that they were able to create a space where they could perform Americanness on their own terms. And with the Kurdish community too, it's been through their activism and through performing, racial and ethnic and religious otherness that makes me think about how coded our notion of citizenship is with the project of exclusion. So by studying these communities, it also forces me to think so much so and really meditate on what are the ways in which I comport myself, the ways in which I perform a sense of identity, the ways in which I teach, and the ways in which I am in the world that is already an exclusive project, that is already based on certain exclusions. And so for me, it's been really important that in studying these communities, but engaging with queer of color critique, queer diasporic critique, and Black feminist theory, I've been able to understand the ways in which there are so many levels of power, and that at these moments we see the ways in which citizenship and inclusion is already bounded through the project of exclusion. And so for me, learning and working with these communities and engaging with these forms of theory is really vital to my own conceptualization of what a much more equitable world could look like. It's a way to imagine that world that is not right now, but could be there in the future through the work that we do.
That is beautiful. And I know that is why your students love your classes. Now, I mean, coming in during this time and trying to teach such a heavy, meaningful, the purpose behind your teaching, how is that? How do you see that playing out during a pandemic, during the swell of the Black Lives Matter movement, and remotely, frankly, you're trying to build connections in a medium that is removing you from that human connection. So how are you playing with that contradiction?
Yeah, yeah. So for me, I have always been that type of teacher who feels most at home being there in person. Because especially someone who's so gifted as a dancer and as a comedian like you are, you know how to read the crowd. And teaching is about reading the crowd, making sense of the expressions and making sense of how they're taking notes to see what is not working, and thus using, like as I study the sporting body, to study the student educational body, to make sense of, oh, they are not getting it, they're not into this, it doesn't make sense, let me go back and try a different strategy. But I cannot read bodies virtually. It's not there. And for students, especially students who are coming from certain class and racial backgrounds, where they're in settings where they don't want to unlock the video, they don't want to show the space that they're in, right? And they might not be allowed to show that space, right? In some cases as well. I am now staring at black screens, right? And I don't have a way to really get closer, to really see what notes they're taking, to see where I can push them further. And so, what I've tried to do is, how do you create moments that can still give them a sense and a space and a time for self expression? For them to toss out all those things that they might be able to do in person in a face to face classroom. So, one of the things that I've done, which I just tried on the go, was in my summer class, for a couple of sessions, we opened up. I said, we're going to have 5 to 10 minutes, no talking, pull out a piece of paper and just write, write, write. And when the session was done, the types of stories student provided, some wrote incredibly beautiful poetry. Others shared honest moments of anxiety, honest expressions of, incredible worry about what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to their families, right? What's happening in this country. And also some were just moments to reflect on silly things in life. And so there's such a wide spectrum. I think in this moment of teaching, we have to be able to carve out spaces that are not a one-way street. And the video and remote teaching is such a one-way street. And so we have to carve out spaces where students can own that space, can own their bodies in that space and time, and share with us what really matters to them. And in this moment of Black Lives Matter, if we cannot work with the youth and the young people that are bringing the very foundations of radical change and radical possibilities, my teaching fails every single time. It has no purpose if it cannot engage with the students on their terms and be able to open up spaces for them to claim the type of futures that they want to live.
Oh my God, that was so powerful.
No, no.
That was so wonderful. Yes, um, I think that's a beautiful way to close it out. But I do want to bring it back to a lighter note. We talked about humor early
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
and through moving through all of these experiences, I could only imagine that humor has softened some of the contradictions and the confusions and the tensions. And I just wanted to keep it open to have you comment on the role of humor in
yeah.
creating that sense of belonging throughout all of your work.
Yeah, yeah, and because social life is funny. We as human beings are incredibly silly, awkward, clumsy beings, and I'm mostly talking about myself. And so, if I can't laugh at myself, I can't create spaces for my students to laugh too. And so, one of the things I think, as you know so well, I mean, your comedy and your critique is so beautiful. And for me, what I want to do is create a space where students also understand that it's okay to laugh, and it's okay to desire, and it's okay to have pleasure in these moments of such white supremacy, police brutality, and state violence, we have desires and pleasures that make us such complex beings that while we're engaging with structural violence, we're also already at that moment carving out worlds that affirm us, that give sense to those around us as well. And so, thus,
and I want to thank you for being such a model
of what
like
I stand on the shoulders of giants,
this world
like
is.
Martin
And
Monalancon,
I'm so grateful
Junaid
because
Rana,
that is how
David
we form
Buttiger,
community.
Nancy Abelman, in
And
this
here
moment
at
of
CUNY,
such
Angie
anti-black
Reyes,
racism,
Arthur
the
Spears,
one thing I want to
people
say,
who create
moments for me to think critically, but laugh at the sheer absurdity of life. Like, I'm an academic. That is funny stuff.
Yeah. Well, do you have any other closing statements or any other stories that there's a lot we covered, but there's also a lot we didn't cover. So,
yeah. In this moment of such anti-black racism, the one thing I want to say, that I feel is so important in this day and age, if we cannot support the funding of ethnic studies, such as Black studies, Asian American studies, Latinx studies, along with gender studies and indigenous studies, we are bound to repeat these forms of violence again and again. So now more than ever, areas of study that engage critically with race and racism are the important compass for us to guide us on our journey to that land that we've all dreamed and we've hoped and we've almost feel like we've touched, but are kept being dragged down because our curriculum, our way of knowing, our media coverage has not engaged critically with the life stories, experiences, hopes, pleasures, and desires of ethnic and racial minorities, indigenous communities, and LGBTQI communities. So in this time, I stand to say Black Lives Matter, trans lives matter, no to the Dakota pipeline, yes to indigenous land rights, no to xenophobia, no Muslim bans, no refugee bans. Let us create not a nation, but spaces that affirm the very democratic ideals we think are the very foundations of our lives. So I just hope ethnic studies and gender and sexuality studies is affirmed and funded and supported because we need it more than ever.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate having you, and I'm going to turn it back to Adam. Thank you so much, Dr. Thangaraj, also known as Stan. Check out his book, Desi Hoop Dreams. It was such a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful and honored to be in this space, to share this space with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to you both. This has been such an enlightening and a fun and heartfelt and deep conversation that has both made my day and now my month. And so,
oh my. But it's no, don't. I might pass out. Don't.
Good thing you're sitting, which is good. So that works out. No, but honestly, like, this has really been a great. I think I'm really excited for folks to be able to digest and reflect on this conversation. And just again, I'm super stoked. I live in Boston right now, so I'm always like, oh, Celtics, there we go.
That last play, Adam.
Yeah,
that last play. They had it to go up 3-0.
And there it goes, right? And this, I mean, because you're right, because the 80s is when they had it. So it's been a little while. But so I think there's more Celtics conversations to come and more conversations to be had. So thank you both. Thank you, Vaidyanti, for hosting and bringing a wonderful conversation. And thank you, Stan, for just incredible insight and really showing us both the limitations, which we hear, but then it's so important to just have conversations lived about why this black-white divide is insane, and it really makes no sense, right? And I really loved the point you made early on about the fact that when the kids in Atlanta were like, "Well, you black or white?" You're like, "I am gray," is perfectly emblematic of like actually how cultural the idea of black and white even is, right? And how it is worth like critically engaging with that and breaking that down. And so at a fundamental color name level, right? So there's so much to do just with that. And so again, thank you for sharing those stories. It's been incredible.
Well, Adam, I was wondering, could I just give a very quick shout out to my two teachers from high school?
Please.
Okay. Yeah, so and I want to really thank the teachers at Druid Hills High School in Atlanta, Georgia, who, as African American teachers in a very white school, demanded the most out of us as students of color, especially African American students, to open up possibilities for colleges and for social mobility that not everyone was committed to. It was a form of mentorship that saved so many of us. So I am so grateful to you, Mrs. Simmons and Mrs. Day, my geometry teacher and my computer science teacher, for being the model that I might someday live up to of teaching and mentorship. Thank you.
Oh man. Okay, we're gonna specifically invite them to listen to join us for this.
We must.
We must. Yeah. This is great. Thank you both, and I can't wait to do it again.
Thank you so much.
Both for everything.